Hi, this is Grandma here, and I'm reading The Apprentice, Chapter 5. As a little review, Arduino has made it up to the attic, and he met Donato. And Donato is a former apprentice who has been chained to the wall within a barred attic. The windows have only bars on it. He never gets to leave. And according to him, his only crime is that he could draw better than the maestro, Cosimo. Is there anything that Arduino can do to help him? Well, we'll have to read on and find out. Chapter 5. You blasted boys, the devil take you. Don't you simpletons know that work doesn't do itself? Melania's yelling roused me from my half sleep. After meeting Donato, I'd spent the rest of the night tossing and turning on my pallet under the stairs. Daylight chased the ghosts from my imagination, but throughout the morning I could hardly concentrate on my chores. What should I do? I had discovered a crime. It wasn't legal to keep someone locked up in an attic against their will. My obligation was to denounce the maestro to the authorities, but the man terrified me. And who would believe me, a lowly apprentice? What's the matter with you? Baldo interrupted my thoughts. Nothing. I decided to keep my knowledge of Donato a secret. We sat down together by the kitchen hearth to eat our lunch. Nothing? He repeated. He's squinting at me. Nothing. I know, he said. You're sick of work. I nodded. It was true. I was tired of cleaning. Who wouldn't be? Besides, if I told him that he was right, he might stop asking me prying questions. Yes, I am tired of it, I said. The maestro only lets me touch the brushes if he wants me to clean them. He hasn't asked me to sketch or even trace a line since the day I arrived. I feel like a servant. Well, you've got a long way to go. I've been here almost a year, and the maestro only lets me watch him draw. He never lets me try it for myself. He stared at the fire, shook his head as if to chase away evil thoughts. The truth is, he continued, I don't care. Painting, ugh, it bores me. His tone was scornful. Now, if you recall, he is the grandson of a famous painter, and he's expected to follow his family, as Arduino was expected to follow his father and grandfather being a tailor. You don't like painting? I asked, incredulous. Then what are you doing here? Oh, sorry, you didn't know that. He moved back and forth on his ample backside and whispered, they're making me learn. I told you my grandfather is Antonio Ferrucci. My family wants me to carry on his art and his business. Either I learn with Cosimo or I learn with him, my grandfather. He paused for a moment before continuing in a more serious tone. My grandfather is a greedy tyrant. He doesn't let me do anything he hasn't ordered me to do. He gives me barely enough food to stay alive, and he uses a whip with more skill than he does a paintbrush. The maestro doesn't teach me much, and he works me hard, but he doesn't beat me. And the food isn't good, but it's enough. I even manage to get extras now and then. If I could, though, what I'd really like to learn to do is cook. My dream is to be a chef in a rich man's house, a house with full pantries. I could only shake my head. The sons of tailors want to be painters, and the son of painters, chefs. I wonder what the sons of chefs would want to be. I spent the next few days in the studio sanding down boards and preparing them with a mixture of plaster of Paris, glue, and water that Pierrot had made up. It filled the house with a strangely purifying aroma. I hadn't been up to see Donato since my first visit. I didn't want to take any chances. Spread it carefully, barked the maestro. Make it perfectly smooth or the brushstrokes will show. Lately, it seemed the maestro spent most of his time in the studio sitting with a warm woolen compress on his stomach. From time to time, he would yell for Melania to come and change it, which she did with no complaints. My thoughts kept turning to Donato. Although I had never liked the maestro, now that I knew about Donato, his presence was almost more than I could bear. I was filled with the desire to take the pestle I used to grind pigments and beat him with it, but when he looked at me, my thoughts froze. In my frustration, I began to doubt. What do I care about Donato? I asked myself as I covered the boards with the plaster of Paris mix. I don't really know the boy in the attic. He's not related to me and he's not my friend. I shouldn't put my future at risk. Painting is more important to me than anything. But I knew deep down what was right. It was a crime to kidnap someone and keep him prisoner. No man can own another. It was a crime, but what could I do? At the end of the day, Melania came into the studio to assign our evening chores. Piero, go and get firewood, she shouted. Arduino, you fetch the water. Baldo, go around and close all the shutters. We're going to have a hard frost tonight. When you're done, your supper will be ready. Frost had already covered the cobbles of the courtyard, and the rope that held the bucket in the water well was stiff. Both Piero and Baldo had finished their chores before me and were seated at the kitchen hearth when I returned from the well. Piero had kindly moved my bowl close to the fire to keep it warm. And we have a picture of Melania and the boys listening to her stories in front of the fire. And this is Melania began. But when he opened the door, my poor uncle found a demon with a toad's face and devil's horns. He pushed my uncle into the paddock, and with a cord made of dried, braided snakes, as they did nearly every night at dinner time, Melania's horrible stories held us in rapt attention, and we forgot about the thin, rancid soup we ate and the sweetly sticky odor of the lamp oil. When we'd finished eating and she'd finished her tale, we cleaned up and went off to bed. Late that night, after everyone, including Melania, was fast asleep, I left my tiny corner and listened to the sounds of the household. The maestro snores, the last logs on the kitchen hearth falling to embers, the elm branch that scratched the tall studio window, the creaking of the beams, nothing out of the ordinary. I climbed the steps to the attic, sat down next to the barred window, lifted the tapestry, and looked in. Light from the full moon flooded the tiny room. Donato, seated on the floor and wrapped in his blankets, was eating. "Donato," I whispered. He raised his head and looked at me. I hadn't seen him in several days, and his gaze seemed even calmer to me than before. Perhaps I was the one who was calmer. "Arduino, thank you for coming back. What are you eating?" I asked. "Well," he looked into the bowl he held between his hands. "It looks like a soup or a gruel. I'm not really sure. It's probably the leftover soup that we had for dinner. It was made with something greasy that tasted rancid and stuck in my throat." "Probably lard," Donato said in his soft voice. "It tastes very good to me." I thought about this and realized that everything is relative. Things that made me sick to my stomach tasted good to Donato because he had even less than I. "Is there any way to take off that shackle?" I asked. "No, the chain links are heavily soldered," Donato explained. "Believe me, in the beginning I tried everything. Besides, even if I could get the chain off, the door is locked and the windows are all barred." "And what about Melania? Have you ever asked her for help?" "I have, and sometimes she looks at me with sympathy, when she looks at me at all. She comes in every night with food and changes my pail, but usually it's without a word. She's too scared of the maestro ever to go against him. Without Cosimo, Melania would have nothing, not even a place to sleep. I'm grateful to her, though. Without her, I surely would have frozen or starved to death up here." I had a bitter taste in my mouth. Listening to Donato, I realized what true cowardice was. Was I afraid to help him for fear of losing my apprenticeship and my chance to become a painter? I could tell someone what the maestro is doing to you, I said. Turn him into the authorities or send for my father. But Donato watched me in silence. But my voice choked. At that moment, all my self-doubt and the difficulty of the situation overwhelmed me. Oh, come now, Arduino, what's the matter with you? Are you crying for me? No, it's just that I really am such a coward. Oh, Arduino. Yes, I am, and selfish too, I said without taking a breath. I could get your freedom tomorrow, but the maestro would throw me out of the studio and my father would force me to return to tailoring. As pathetic as it is, this is my only chance to learn to be a painter. Donato pulled on the chain so that he could get closer to the window. Arduino, calm down a minute and listen to me. I don't expect you to sacrifice your dreams for me, nor do I want you to. I know that someday I will be free from this prison. Just knowing that you are my friend gives me some strength. Besides, true freedom isn't in the street or in Cosimo's studio or in the air or in the sea. Freedom is inside each one of us. But think about it, Arduino. You aren't really free either. You have to obey the maestro and Melania and your father. They occupy your thoughts and perhaps even keep you from living your dreams. I can't move, but my time and thoughts are mine alone. Do you see? I'm freer than you in many ways. He was right. I was always at the mercy of someone else. Don't worry about me, he continued. You will help me when you're ready. I've survived this long and I'm at peace with myself and others. I would venture to say that I'm even happy in my own way. Look, he pointed to the floor in the corner of the attic. From where I was, I could make out some marks in the dust. I can even draw and study perspective, symmetry, and composition. You know so much about art, I said, so much more than I do, things I've never even heard of. Well, would you like to learn of them? Yes, but how? Come up here when you can. I'll teach you what I can. I looked at him. In spite of his uncombed hair and his dirty, threadbare velvet doublet, he was an elegant man. I thought I recognized my grandfather's wisdom in his young eyes. Yes, Donato, I said, I will come up every chance I get. Chapter 6. The weeks that followed were the most intense that I can remember. During the day, I helped Melania clean and organize the house. I worked in the studio and took care of the horse. At night, I crept up the attic stairs to meet with Donato. We were careful to whisper and make as little noise as possible so as not to wake anyone sleeping below. I had taken some supplies from the studio, a pencil, some paper, a brush, some paints, which Donato stored in the attic. By the light of the moon, when there was one, he showed me everything he had learned from the maestro, as well as what he discovered within the walls of his prison, about light, shadow, reflection, lines, and angles. In the mornings, I dragged through my chores, but despite my exhaustion, I was energized by my freedom, my friendship with Donato, and by everything he was teaching me. My father had sent me a letter at Christmas time saying that everyone at home was well and thinking of me, as well as a package with new clothes and some roasted chestnuts. I took the chestnuts up to the attic where Donato and I celebrated the holiday on our own. For the first time since I'd arrived at the studio, I felt happy. Though my happiness was always tempered by worry for Donato and a feeling of helplessness, but it wouldn't be long before something would happen to change the course of all of our lives. Boy, Melania yelled. She was in top form that morning. Are you in love with that broom? You're asleep with her in your arms. Baldo and Piero laughed, and Marco looked at me from top to bottom, sneering. What's going on out there? The maestro thundered from the depths of his bedchamber. Nothing's going on, Melania shot back. Then in a voice only we could hear, she added, drooling magpie, "If you want to know what's going on, get out of bed and come see." He finally entered the studio that day after lunch. This was late even for him. Baldo and I were preparing an egg yolk and vinegar adhesive, while Piero and Marco worked on their projects, when we all heard 3 loud knocks at the front door. Baldo and I looked at each other. Who could it be? Since I'd been there, Cosimo de Forli's house had had only 2 regular visits, the cold and local priest, and the priest came only in the mornings. "Melania, see who it is," bellowed the maestro from his seat by the fire. Yes, I'm going," she called from the kitchen. A moment later, she was at the studio door. "There's a nobleman outside," she said excitedly. "What did you say? Who is it?" growled Cosimo. "A nobleman with a lot of servants." I'd never seen Melania so nervous. The maestro stood up and, with Melania's help, slowly dragged his hunched figure down the hall. When they both disappeared behind the curtain that separated the entryway from the hallway, the 4 of us boys quietly crept after them and peered as best we could through a narrow opening in the curtain. The maestro looked through the peephole and then closed it with a bang. He straightened up, pushed back his hair with his hands, smoothed his robe, and opened the heavy door. There stood the Duke of Algora. I recognized him immediately. He was one of my father's best clients. I also recognized the woolen cloak, my father's work. And here's a picture of the Duke with the cloak. "Greetings, maestro," said the Duke in a dignified tone. "How do you do?" "Oh, very well, my lord," said Cosimo, "but come in, please. It's much too cold outside." The Duke made a small signal with his hand, and 2 of his servants helped him remove his cloak. He entered the room slowly, looking around impassively, as was to be expected of someone of his class. The thin, red-clad form of his secretary slid in behind him. The other men in the entourage stayed in the street by the luxurious coach in which the Duke had arrived. The maestro closed the door and offered the Duke one of the chairs at the table in the entryway. Then he sat down and ordered Melania to fetch an oil lamp. We jumped back from the curtain as she brushed past us. She was so nervous she forgot to order us all back to the studio. We resumed our positions at the curtain. "Dear maestro," began the nobleman, "I would like to know if there is time in your schedule to undertake a new project. If so, I have a commission for you." The maestro leaned on the edge of the table in order to stand up again. Melania glared at us before she entered the room with the lamp, which she set down next to the Duke. "My lord, I'm honored that you had come to see me," said the maestro. The Duke smiled and removed his gloves. "How could I go elsewhere? Your marvelous allegory on freedom graces all the festivities in my grand ballroom." Allegory on freedom? Cosimo had painted an allegory on freedom? Cosimo de Forli, you kept the best student prisoner for being a better artist than he was? I felt my mouth fill with bile. This was my maestro, a man from whom I could learn only hypocrisy. "My daughter is marrying, dear maestro," the Duke continued. "Little Bianca," said Cosimo with a wide smile. "Not so little anymore," he laughed. "She's nearly 15 years old. She's a lovely creature," the maestro gushed. "Yes, she's very lovely, but the palace chapel is a bit, how shall I say, a bit unlovely. Yes, that's the word. My lady said, I thought that if the wall behind the altar were painted, it would be much more attractive. But of course, my lady the Duchess has exquisite taste. All of Florence is of that opinion." How could the maestro know what all of Florence thinks when he never leaves his dirty old house, I wondered. It was all false praise. "We hope that you, Maestro de Forli, will prepare a sketch of your idea for the chapel wall painting." It will be a pleasure, my lord. I will draw and deliver it myself. The nobleman rose from his chair. He stretched his hand to his secretary, who handed him a small pouch. It jingled with coins. 40 ducats for your initial expense, said the Duke, placing the pouch on the table. When you present the sketch, if it is to our liking, you will receive another such payment. We will then determine the balance of your fee for the actual painting, which will depend on the materials you need and the amount of work necessary to prepare the wall. Are you in agreement? Cosimo put his hand on the pouch. Thank you, my lord. You are always so generous. Both you and your distinguished wife will be satisfied. It will be my masterpiece, I can assure you. But one thing, yes, the theme, my lord. What do you wish the painting to represent? Oh, that is up to your imagination, my dear maestro. You are the artist. The Duke and his secretary moved toward the door, which the maestro opened for them. Just outside, the Duke put on his cloak with the help of 2 servants. The wedding is to be in early summer, he said. I hope you will remember that in your time is limited, maestro. Of course. Do not worry, my lord. Cosimo closed the door, turned around, and pressed his hands to his stomach. From his expression, he seemed to be in great pain. Melania! He howled. God save me, exclaimed the servant. Build up the fire, it's freezing in this house, and make me some broth and hot wine. We hurried back to the studio. What's wrong with him? I asked Piero. Nothing, answered Piero in a thin voice. He has a commission. Arduino! The master's shout made my hair stand on end. Yes, maestro. Sharpen all the charcoals, clean the brushes and the palettes. I want everything as good as new. Do you understand? Yes, maestro. And from that moment on, the whole house was in a frenzy. Melania worked in the kitchen and kept after us with a vengeance. I did whatever I was told, while Piero prepared the materials that would be used for the first sketch. Baldo cleaned the tables before putting down new sheets of paper. He took advantage of the confusion to go in and out of the kitchen, eating what he could find. Marco went through an enormous portfolio of drawings, separating the religious themes from the mythological and ornamental ones. The maestro had announced that the theme of the fresco would be the marriage of the Virgin. That night, I sat next to the barred window and described to Donato in detail everything that had happened that day. I wonder if he can handle this commission, I said. Well, why wouldn't he? He's done it many times before. But he gets so nervous, I explained. Besides, I think he's ill. Ill? Yes, I told you he's been acting strangely these last few weeks. Getting up late, hot compresses and all that. Today he could barely walk to the front door without Melania's help. Donato was silent. Then he sighed and rubbed his eyes. This will be your opportunity, Arduino. The painting in the Duke's chapel will be a fresco, a very complicated undertaking. Cosimo will need all the help he can get. I'm sure he'll have something for you to do. Oh, of course he will. I get to break the eggs to make the base. Donato covered his mouth to stifle a laugh. Let me tell you about fresco painting. That night, I began to learn the best way to prepare the walls and the way to trace the drawings with perforated paper, how to plan the work according to colors, how to shade with the color still partially wet, and how to keep the color from running. We talked all night until a half-dozen chirping sparrows signaled the onset of a new day. Only then did I make my way back down to my pallet so Melania wouldn't miss me when she woke up. Wow, I don't know how Arduino is doing it, working all day, doing his chores, and then staying up all night getting art lessons from Donato. But he seems happier to at least be getting some art lessons. Okay, bye-bye.